because of this introduction, for the sake of brevity, will necessarily be inadequate, leaving out as much as it contains. Ajamu Baraka has been at work in grassroots education and activism for more than 4 decades. He's a veteran organizer with early roots in the Black liberation movement, anti-apartheid, and Central American solidarity struggles. He has provided human rights trainings for activists across the country, briefings on human rights to the U.S. Congress, and appeared before and provided statements to various United Nations agencies, including the UN Human Rights Commission. From 2004 to 2011, he served as the founding executive director of the U.S. Human Rights Network, an organization that links hundreds of grassroots organizations and thousands of activists to strengthen a human rights movement and culture in the United States. Prior to his work at the network, he was co-convener of the Mississippi Workers Center for Human Rights and played an instrumental role in developing a series of biannual Southern Human Rights Organizers conferences, some of the first post-Cold War human rights training opportunities for grassroots activists across the country. In addition to his activism, Ajamu is a prolific educator. His writing has appeared in many publications such as Black Commentator, Common Dreams, Mbazaka, and Dissident Voice. In 2016, he ran as the vice presidential nominee of the Green Party of the United States. Currently, he is a contributing columnist for the Black Agenda Report and Counterpunch, and is the national organizer and spokesperson for the Alliance, the Black Alliance for Peace, an organization that seeks to recapture and redevelop the historic anti-war, anti-imperialist, and pro-peace positions of the Black radical movement. Tonight, he will be speaking on the human rights challenge to war and the new McCarthyism. There will be a brief audience Q&A afterwards. SES would like to thank Ajamu for his agreeing to speak at Truman tonight and for his contributions to the liberation of oppressed people.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. Thank all of you for taking time out of your busy schedules to be with me this evening. I want to really give a real shout out of thanks to the SES for bringing me to Truman. It's been a pleasure to be here and a pleasure to have a chance to take part, although briefly, in the class that they are conducting. I just want to say to them, I move around this country, and I see a lot. I see a lot of organizing. I get a chance to get to many, many campuses. And I can tell you that what you all have here is special. And I applaud you for the work that you are doing. And I want to tell you, keep doing what you're doing. And don't let anybody ever tell you that we cannot envision and work for an alternative. So thank you, SES. I want to share some comments, and then I really want to get to a point where we can have a conversation. I'm not one that wants to talk at people for an evening. I think it's important to have conversations. I'm going to, as Ben said, my title, my topic is to talk about the issue of war and peace, to bring that issue to light using the human rights lens, and to talk also about what is really troubling and which is a challenge to all of us, and that is what we are calling, many of us calling, the new McCarthyism. And basically, I want to just make three points. I want to talk about why I don't get involved in the anti-Trumpism and why I think it's a dead end. I want to touch on the issue of Russiagate and how that has brought us to the new McCarthyism. And then we'll end by talking about what needs to be done. Well, we have a situation today in this country where we have what many people believe to be a serious challenge. That we have an administration that many argue is a fundamental departure from what we've had in the past. And in many ways, that may be the case. But there's also continuity. When I say that I'm not going to concern myself so much with Trump, the personality, it's because I believe that the focus on Trump as an individual becomes a diversion. It is it points our attention away from the continuity of policies and positions by the state. It does not allow us to take a look at the continuation of the structural realities, the structural contradictions that created Trump. So in many ways, anti-Trumpism, it abstracts Trump from the historical context. It becomes almost like a reactionary position that only has the effect of propping up the other party, of getting the people conditioned and set up for yet another round of the lesser of two evils, which for me is a real problem. Because the real issue that we have to face here in this country is the fact that neoliberal capitalism is not working. It's not working for the vast majority of the people here in this country. So despite what Trump might say in the State of the Union, despite what Barack Obama said in his State of the Union, pointing to all of the stats that suggest that there has been an economic recovery, the objective reality when we move around this country is that millions of people are still suffering. I move around and people ask me, Ajamu, where is this recovery? I don't feel it in my individual life. I'm working 2 jobs just to make ends meet. Why is it that they tell us there's been a recovery, but when you look at who really recovered, it appears that the only ones who really recovered was the 1%. Because the 95% of the income that has been accumulated since 2009 has gone to their pockets. When the Democrats, and not even Donald Trump, talk about jobs and recovery, what are we talking about? We're talking about jobs that basically are low wage, part-time, temporary jobs, 94%. When you go to other parts of this country outside of Missouri, even here, you see the effects of neoliberalism. You see the factories that are closed down. You see the pothole roads. You still see people who are walking the streets because they have no place to lay their heads at night. You see the abandoned houses. And you wonder, again, where is the recovery? So for us, if we're not raising the right questions, then we can find ourselves, in essence, basically just perpetuating illusions and working against the objective interests of the people. So for me, anti-Trumpism is something we have to move away from. And I'm not suggesting that we're not concerned or should not be concerned about the fact that because of some of the inflammatory rhetoric that racist elements have been emboldened. I think it's a real concern we have to have in terms of the xenophobia that we see coming from the administration. Comments that seem to support traditional kinds of white supremacist assumptions about various groups in this country. Those are all concerns that we must have. We have to be concerned about the rise of the more visible radical right in places like Charlottesville. But my concern is as we're looking at Charlottesville and the alt-right, while we're being entertained by the latest tweet from Donald Trump, we have the state and the corporate sector working against us and undermining our interests and strengthening their control. We're looking at Donald Trump, and what we are not seeing is a new form of a kind of liberal totalitarianism developing, using the excuse of Russiagate as an instrument to basically begin to constrain and constrict the scope of discourse in this country, access to radical political analysis and information, a new kind of thought policing. And that process is being aided and abetted by the Democrats and some Republicans. So I'm concerned about that kind of movement more so than the entertainment value of Donald Trump. For me, we've got to make sure we maintain an understanding of what it is we're up against and what we in fact need to be struggling for. What we have to struggle for, my friends, is a new conception of society. A new conception of society informed by an alternative ethical framework. For some of us, we call this people-centered human rights. That is the commitment that, and understanding that we all not only have certain kinds of rights as a consequence of us being human beings, but that if a society is organized in such a way that those basic rights that we all should have access to in order to live a dignified life, food, housing, education, a clean environment, health care, that if society is organized to undermine our ability to realize those rights, then the people-centered approach to human rights says that we have a right and a responsibility to alter that society, to transform that society. So the people-centered human rights framework is a fighting framework. It is a framework that is committed to radical social transformation. It is a framework that says that the full range of human rights to be realized suggests that in order for those kinds of rights to be realized, they can only be realized within the context of a different kind of society. A society organized under a new basis. A society that many people might classify and characterize as socialist. So this is a different kind of understanding of human rights that says that basically we cannot be full humans, we cannot really develop our full human capacities within the context of neoliberal capitalism. So this is the kind of framework we have to have that takes us beyond Trump. It is a framework that shows us that indeed there is an alternative. That this society, this economy, the way it's organized, the politics that they tell us are normal, that basically we can go beyond that. And that's why the class today is so important. The study that you are involved in. Equipping yourself with a framework of understanding that can be directive as we organize people and show them the contradictions and begin to show them the direction we have to go as a movement. So for me, the Trump phenomenon is a manifestation of the contradictions of this society, and what we have to do is understand that both of the major political parties collude between themselves in ensuring that the mass of the people in this country continue to be asleep, continue to support policies that objectively are against their interests, both major political parties. So that kind of understanding demystifies politics. It demystifies the process of us being directed toward Trump and Republicans and giving Democrats a free hand. That is the only way that we can begin to understand then the role of issues like war and peace and subversion. We have to have a critical understanding of the objective interests that both parties are supporting in order for us to be able to disconnect from those positions and help for the people to disconnect from those positions. For the people to understand that basically their interest is not the same interest as the 1%. That when the 1% talks about national interests and national threats, that the people have to be able to distinguish what that really means. That's important because we say that because this system is not able to be reformed, that the only weapon that it appears to have now in order to maintain itself is increased political repression, increased dependence on violence. And that's why we see the issue of war becoming such a central component of politics here in this country. And again, supported by both parties. We saw the spectacle in D.C. leading up to the last agreement on the budget. We saw, again, diversions around some of the other issues. But what we didn't really have much conversation about was the fact that both major political parties are supporting the war agenda. Both parties supported this obscene expansion of the budget for war and militarism and death and destruction. You might recall that when the Trump administration came in office, they made a request for expanding the military budget by $54 billion. And everybody said that was obscene. And in fact, you had some elements of the Democratic Party in opposition. But then all of a sudden, the Democrats stopped talking about the budget, the military budget. Why? Because they quietly signaled that they were going to, in fact, support the expansion of the military budget. And in fact, that is exactly what occurred. So that now the military budget is being expanded next year by $70 billion. And in 2019, it'll be $80 billion. So both parties are complicit. Both parties are protecting the objective interests of the 1% and calling that national interest. And in doing that, they are attempting to convince us to support them in their following. They want us to send our sons and daughters off into the military to go off and fight other working class or poor people to protect their interests. We say no more. We say that if the 1% wants to fight some other nation, if the North Koreans or the Iranians or whatever are perceived to be a threat to them, send your own sons and daughters off and leave us alone. That's our position. So what we have to do, my friends, is basically understand that what we up against is something that cannot be simply reduced to just a bipartisan struggle. That all we need to do is get rid of Donald Trump and bring in the Democrats and everything will be fine. We have to recognize that there are certain positions, certain issues that require that all of us, no matter what our party affiliations might be, all of us who are human beings, all of us who recognize we're part of a collective humanity, that we've got to recognize that we have interests that are with the global humanity and not with the 1%. Today, we have to take a position against war. We have to take a position against imperialism. Now, we are attempting to, in fact, do that by building a new anti-war So what we are saying basically is that when you look at the policies of Donald Trump, you see a continuity and policies that have been undermining the objective human rights of people for the last 40 years in this country. Ever since the U.S. made its turn toward neoliberalism in the 1970s. That this process has been a bipartisan process, and the result has been the conditions that created Donald Trump in the U.S., Marine Le Pen in France, and all of the right-wing political parties and movements we see throughout the Western world. And at the center of the concerns of many of these elements that are organized, these radical nationalists, their concerns is that they are seeing a change in their lifestyles, and they are now susceptible to the demagoguery from racists like Donald Trump and Le Pen, appealing to white supremacy, appealing to the notion of Western civilizational superiority, and identifying convenient others to explain how their lives are changing. What we have to do is build movements, have messages that help people to understand what the real enemy is. The enemy is not Muslims or immigrants. The enemy is an economic and political and social system that is unable to create and project healthy human beings, to create a society in which we all can live as rational human beings, a system that is reducing anger, alienation, disconnection, oppression, that this is the enemy, not some folks who are suffering and facing violence in their countries, who then try to get into the U.S. in order to try to transform their lives and to live more decently. They're not the enemies. The enemy is a system that's unable to produce humane conditions. So we have to be the ones to raise those issues. We've got to raise those issues, because if we don't do that, then we're going to have the demagogues who will continue to point us against each other, who will continue to have working class people who are struggling, looking at one another as the enemy. If we don't build movements that are centered on a notion of human rights, a notion that we can be more than what we are today, then we will allow ourselves to be used as instruments against ourselves and against other people here on this planet. So, my friends, what we are saying basically is that anti-Trumpism is dead in politics. Anti-Trumpism only pops up the neoliberal policy of the Democratic Party. Anti-Trumpism is a diversion. And what we have to do is build a new kind of movement to ensure that we can put a block on the policies that are taking us toward war and militarism. And when we talk about war and militarism, we want to not only talk about militarism as it impacts people outside our borders, but militarism as it impacts people right here in this country. That when you look at the terror that people are being subjected to by ICE, for example, because they may be undocumented. When you look at the militarism of the 1033 program that allows for a surplus of military equipment to be transferred from the military to police forces around this country. When you see the results with the systematic killings of black and brown people and white folks every year in this country. These are the kinds of consequences of militarism. When those kinds of killings are justified and people begin to become sort of immune to them, The same way we become immune to the fact that the U.S. has been involved in a veritable rampage across the Middle East, resulting in the destructions of societies across the so-called Middle East, then we are facing a certain kind of spiritual death. And we are creating for ourselves the conditions that can end up being even more detrimental for us here in this country, as the 1% is pointing its weapons of destruction against us, and in particular those of us who are trying to raise serious questions. One of the instruments that they are using, of course, is this new McCarthyism. As I said earlier, we have a situation now with Russiagate and the concerns that have been voiced by people around the alleged interference in the elections here in the U.S. by Russians. And what we've seen is that this concern with Russiagate has resulted in the people allowing themselves to be infantilized. You have Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, who have now taken upon themselves to censor and determine and suggest what kind of information will be exposed to the general public. They want to alert you that you may be getting information from some source that they claim is connected to a foreign government. They want to suggest that the only news is not fake news, is the news coming from the 6 major corporations that control all of the news content at this point in terms of the mainstream. They want us to believe that there's only a certain range of thought that's really acceptable. Anything beyond that is suspect. They want people to have fear and to not see the kind of moves being made by the state to tighten their ideological grip on all of us. And we have to push back. When you look at the first McCarthy period in the 1950s, objectively what was happening? In the 1950s, you had the U.S. emerging as the most powerful state on the planet. They had a rival in the Soviet Union, and they had the concept of containment. Now, many people believe that containment was centered on a military containment. The concern was using the military to contain the Soviet Union. Well, you had a military component. The main element, though, of containment was ideological. So as the U.S. emerged as this world power in the 1950s, they wanted to also project themselves and to ensure that they had ideological support internally. So what did they do? They began to target the dissidents, target the leftists, the progressives, to push them out of circles and structures, institutions where they could have any kind of ideological influence out of the schools, both secondary and college, out of the unions, out of Hollywood. So you have this ideological component of containment. And we know the story. In this new McCarthyism, in today's world, in 2018, you have the same kind of concern. Well, the issue today is even more dangerous than it was in the 1950s. Because in the 1950s, you still had a pretty vigorous capitalism. You have, for many sectors of the population, the possibility of transforming their lives. You had the expansion of the economy, suburbanization, you know, the working class becoming the middle class in the 1950s. So people were buying into the system. So it didn't matter that you still had a sector of the population that was being suppressed, that was imprisoned because of their ideas, that were being hunted out of their jobs. And that's all right, that happens. But today, the situation is fundamentally different and even more dangerous. Why? Because the internal contradictions of neoliberal capitalism are such that the kinds of reforms we saw in the 1950s, the economic expansion that people experienced, that's no longer available. That because of those contradictions, the only way now the system is able to sustain itself is by suppressing workers, constraining workers, undermining their ability to live well by suppressing their wages, not addressing their health needs, not putting in place a minimum wage that allows for a sustainable living, not allowing for workers to organize themselves in order to protect their interests. What you have today is a situation where now, because of the contradictions, this system cannot be reformed. So the fallback position now is on repression, containment, political containment, ideological containment, structural containment in terms of mass incarceration, and a police force that's out of control. So the terms are now more precarious, more dangerous for everybody. The likelihood of this becoming even more violent is quite apparent, because the ideological support that the system had in the 1950s, through the 70s and 80s has dissipated. Now you have a societal-wide legitimation crisis. You have a situation where 13% of the people support the Congress, where almost 70% of independents want to see a third party, where people have no faith at all in their institutions, where the concern is not having a critical perspective on what is happening with the whole Trump phenomenon in terms of the role of the FBI and what may be collaboration between the FBI and other intelligence agencies to undermine Trump's ability to govern. The concern now for Democrats and for others is to uphold the institutions of the intelligence agency, to reject any kind of critique and criticism of the FBI as being un-American. This is all part of that process of ideological containment and mystification, because the stakes are much higher today than they were in the 1950s. That's why we have this collaboration between the corporate and financial sector and the media and communication sectors and the government in determining what kind of information you and I will be exposed to or have access to. So we are now in the middle of this new McCarthyism, because the stakes are much more higher than they were at any other point in U.S. history. And that element, that aspect of what we're up against has to be surfaced and it has to be dealt with. Because if we allow them to normalize this kind of censorship of attempting to determine what kind of information we have access to, you have this situation, you have the elimination of net neutrality, and now that we have become dependent on social media and its ability to influence, we are facing a situation now where real totalitarianism is a real possibility. The kind of 1984 nightmare, is becoming a reality in 2018 if we don't push back. So what do we have to do? In closing, my friends, we have to build new people's movements. We've got to make sure that we understand that the power belongs with us. We have to give space to our young folks who are organizing themselves and trying to grapple with these new realities. You have to recognize that both of these two major parties are representing the same kinds of interests, and not be confused by the spectacles we see in Washington. There are tactical differences, sometimes even strategic differences between the two major parties, but they both are part of the rule of the oligarchy. And that we've got to recognize that so that we don't allow for ourselves to be confused, and we don't allow for our sons and daughters to be used as cannon fodder for these interests. Trump's new national security strategy represents a move away from the hustle of anti-terrorism to the very real dangerous position that now the new fight is between great powers. The same kind of great power capitalist competition that led us into World War I. We've got to recognize that and make sure that we don't allow ourselves to be used in that process. It means centering once again the issue of anti-war, of understanding we're part of an empire where we have 800 to 1,000 bases around the world, and we have a ruling class that is ready to use this awesome power of this state in order to maintain this interest. We've got to separate ourselves from those policies. We've got to recognize again that our interest is not with the 1%, our interests are with the people in this country and the people around the world. So the challenge is building a movement, is understanding we can be more than what we are today, is recognizing